The year was 1872, and the village sat tucked away in the folds of a forgotten valley, the kind of place that rarely appeared on maps, and even less often in memory. It was a place shaped by the land around its ensed woods that pressed in on all sides, a river that swelled and shrank with the seasons, and a single cobbled road that connected it, in theory at least, to the greater world. But the villagers did not think of the world beyond. Their lives revolved around survival, planting, harvesting, surviving the winters that bit at their bones, and above it all, towering both in stone and in power, was the church. The church was more than a building of prayer. It was the very heart of the village. Its steeple rose higher than any tree in the forest, a sharp silhouette that pierced the gray skies. On Sundays, the bells called out in tones so deep that they seemed to rattle the marrow in one's bones. To outsiders, had there been any, it might have seemed like just another parish, another place of worship built on faith and community. But to those who lived under its shadow, the church was both sanctuary and sovereign. Built from pale stone, cut from the nearby quarry, the structure bore the weight of centuries. Its walls were thick and damp, forever breathing out the smell of old mortar and incense. At its doors, villagers crossed themselves without thought, not so much from devotion as from fear of what might follow if they didn't. The priest's word was law, and his sermons painted the world in stark colors. Obedience meant salvation, doubt meant damnation. This rigid faith governed their days. Children learned it at their mother's knee, and grown men bent their heads beneath it long after their backs had stiffened from labor. The church did not just dictate matters of God, it dictated life. It decided when marriages would be sanctified, when disputes would be settled, when land would be blessed, and even when fields could be harvested. Death, too, fell under its dominion. The ground surrounding the churchyard brimmed with centuries of the dead, marked by crooked crosses and stones whose inscriptions had long worn away. To be buried there was considered an honor. To be denied the soil of the churchyard was considered a curse. In such a place, the line between reverence and fear blurred into something that villagers dared not question. Inside, the church was at once beautiful and oppressive. Tall, narrow windows let in slivers of light, painting the interior in pale blues and reds from the stained glass. Candles flickered in iron sconces along the walls, their flames trembling in the drafts that seeped through the cracks in the stone. At the altar, a massive crucifix loomed, carved from dark wood that seemed to absorb the light around it, and beneath that crucifix, the priest stood week after week, draped in heavy robes, his voice filling the chamber with promises of eternal life and warnings of eternal fire. The villagers listened, not daring to speak, their eyes fixed on him as though salvation itself hung on the movement of his lips. Children were taught to revere the church as sacred ground. They were reminded that every stone, every beam, every nail had been laid with holy intent. Yet even among the youngest, there was unease. The church was cold, not just in the winter, but always, as if the walls themselves retained some memory of sorrow. The echo of footsteps lingered too long, and shadows pooled in the corners, never fully chased away by sunlight or candlelight. Children whispered to each other that the church was alive, that it breathed at night, that sometimes it even listened. Still, the rituals continued. Every baptism was carried out beneath its vaulted ceiling. Every wedding, every confession, every funeral. Generations passed through those doors, their lives marked by the rhythm of bells and prayers. It was, outwardly at least, the most ordinary of rural parishes. But behind the surface of devotion lay another truth. The church was not merely a house of God, it was a house of power. The priest himself was not just a man of faith. He was judge, mediator, and keeper of secrets. He knew which families were struggling to feed themselves, who had quarreled with whom, who had sinned and begged for forgiveness behind the closed door of the confessional. That knowledge was a form of currency, and he wielded it with precision. His eyes lingered too long on the children during Mass, and though no one dared voice their discomfort, the unease hung in the air like smoke. The walls of the church seemed to absorb everything: the whispered prayers, the muffled sobs of confession, the cries of infants baptized in cold water. But they absorbed other things too, things less holy, for villagers who walked its aisles in the dim hours before dawn, when the doors were unlocked for prayer. There were sensations difficult to explain: the feeling of being watched, the sound of faint knocking where no hand struck. They dismissed these as tricks of the mind, the result of hunger, fatigue, or too much wine. Yet the stories circulated quietly, never aloud in daylight, but in hushed voices by the hearth. And still, they came, because the church was not optional. To reject it was to reject the community, to invite suspicion, to risk being branded a heretic, or worse, even if unease gnawed at them. Even if shadows seemed to stretch too long across the pews, they bowed their heads and obeyed. Fear, after all, was a powerful form of devotion. The year 1872 did not announce itself with catastrophe. It came like all other years, through cold winds and gray skies, through the ceaseless toil of planting and gathering. Yet in that year, the church would be tested. Its foundation had begun to crumble in places, mortars worn thin by rain and time cracks spider-webbed across certain walls, dampness bled through in others. To the villagers, this was more than simple decay. A weakening church was a sign of weakening faith. Repairs had to be made, not just to preserve the stone, but to preserve the illusion of strength and eternity. And so workers were summoned, men with calloused hands and heavy tools, charged with the sacred duty of reinforcing God's house. They did not know, as they set their chisels and hammers against the wall, that what they uncovered would shake the village to its core. They did not know that behind the facade of holy stone lay something older, something hidden, something so dark that it would demand to be forgotten almost as quickly as it was revealed. But for now, in those early months of 1872, the church stood as it always had, looming, silent, a monument to both faith and fear. Its secrets pressed deep into the mortar, waiting for the day they would claw their way out. It began quietly, as such things always do. One child missing here, another there. Their absences explained away with the kind of weary logic that villages often use to comfort themselves. Life was precarious enough in those years that tragedy felt like a constant companion. A boy might drown in the river, a girl might be taken by wolves, an infant might simply not wake in the morning. These things happened, and people knew to lower their heads and murmur prayers. But what unfolded in that valley in the years leading up to 1872 was not the usual tally of misfortunes. It was something stranger, something more deliberate, and though the signs were visible, few dared to speak them aloud. The first whispers came when a child vanished on an ordinary afternoon. He had been sent to the well to fetch water, the kind of task entrusted to boys barely older than 6 or 7. When his bucket was found overturned in the mud, with no trace of him nearby, the villagers gathered at the edge of the woods to search. They called his name until their voices cracked, combed the riverbank for hours, lit torches, and pressed into the dark underbrush. Nothing. Not a torn scrap of cloth, not a trail of small footprints. The earth had swallowed him whole, or so it seemed. His parents wept. The priest intoned that God had called him home, and life pressed forward with the stubborn momentum of necessity. But then it happened again. This time, a girl who had been seen skipping near the churchyard at dusk. She was laughing with another child, a ribbon tied in her hair, and then gone. The other child could not say where she went, only that she was there one moment, and absent the next. At first, adults dismissed the tale as confusion, the imagination of youth. Yet the parents knew. They had heard the silence in the streets at night, had felt the weight of unease pressing into their homes like the damp of the stone walls. Something was happening. Though no one wished to admit it, by the time the third and fourth children disappeared, the excuses grew thin. The villagers clung to explanations. Wolves had grown bold, or passing strangers had stolen them away. But deep down, no one believed these stories. The woods had yielded no tracks, the roads had seen no travelers, and wolves did not pluck children. Silently from the center of a village, the truth was darker, though it lay hidden beneath layers of fear and obedience. Some parents began keeping their children inside after dusk, locking doors that had never been locked before. Others walked their little ones to the fields, never letting them wander out of sight. Still, the disappearances continued. A girl vanished in daylight while gathering herbs at the edge of the forest. A pair of brothers disappeared together while chasing each other near the river. Each time, the searches were thorough. Men carried lanterns into the caves and waded waist-deep into the waters. Women tied bells to their doors, hoping for protection. Nothing returned to them but silence. What made the vanishings unbearable was not only the loss, but the lack of answers. Grief with an explanation can be carried. Grief without one becomes poison. Mothers pressed their faces into pillows at night to stifle their sobs. Fathers grew hollow-eyed, their hands trembling on tools at work. Some whispered of curses, others of demons. And yet, whenever questions rose too high, the church's shadow fell across them. The priest would speak, his voice resonant in the cold stone nave, and remind them that doubt was the devil's trick. He would caution them against gossip, against fear, against testing God's plan. And because the villagers had always bent beneath the church's weight, they bent again, swallowing their unease like bitter medicine. Still, the rumors never ceased. Children talked among themselves, their voices low but urgent. They said that the missing ones had been called inside the church, that they had gone through the doors and never come out. They spoke of hearing cries in the night, muffled and echoing, as if trapped within stone. When these stories trickled back to the ears of adults, they were scolded, dismissed, told that imagination was dangerous. Yet the stories lingered. They clung to the air like smoke, impossible to wash away. As the number of disappearances grew, patterns began to surface. The missing children were often last seen near the church, sometimes during the quiet hours between dusk and full night. They were not always the weakest or the smallest. Some were sturdy boys on the cusp of adolescence, but they shared one thing. They were young, unformed, still in the liminal space between innocence and understanding. To their families, this pattern was too terrible to name, for to name it would be to accuse the very institution that held their lives together, and so the disappearances became something half-believed, half-buried. Officially, they were accidents, the kinds of tragedies that happen in any village. Unofficially, they were wounds no one dared touch. Mothers began tying charms to their children's clothing, bits of iron. Herbs woven into small pouches, measures against evil, though they never said from where that evil came. Fathers lingered at doorways longer than before, scanning the shadows, searching for movements that weren't there. But nothing they did mattered. The vanishings continued with the slow persistence of a disease, one that devoured the village from the inside. It is easy, from the distance of history, to wonder why no one acted more directly, why no mob stormed the church, why no accusations were shouted aloud. But fear does not work that way. These villagers lived in a world where the church was not merely a building, but the axis upon which everything turned. To question it was to risk exile, to risk damnation, to risk losing the fragile order that kept famine and chaos at bay. And so they clung to silence, even as their children slipped away. One by one, by the time the count reached 19, the silence had become unbearable. Though no one tallied the number aloud, everyone knew it. 19 small beds left empty. 19 names no longer called at supper. 19 sets of parents who looked at each other with hollow eyes but did not speak. The grief had spread through the village like a plague, leaving every home touched in some way. Yet still, the church bells rang each Sunday, and still, the priest's voice thundered through the nave. And still, the walls held their secrets. The whispers of disappearances became less like rumor and more like a shadow stitched into the fabric of the village. Even those who tried to deny it could not avoid it. The sound of laughter seemed scarce, the streets felt emptier, and every child who remained was guarded with an almost desperate vigilance. And yet, beneath that vigilance, there lingered the sickening knowledge that nothing could stop whatever was happening. It would continue, as long as the silence did. The villagers were trapped between the grief of their losses and the terror of speaking the truth. They lived in the hollow, where faith and fear met, where obedience became complicity, where 19 children vanished into thin air, and no one dared to say where they had truly gone. The church's role in the disappearances was never spoken aloud in those days. Not in public, not even in the privacy of one's home. To suggest it openly was to risk everything: reputation, livelihood, perhaps even life itself. Yet for many villagers, the suspicion grew silently, like mold spreading beneath plasticine, but impossible to ignore. The vanishings happened too often in the church's shadow. The sermons, instead of offering comfort, began to feel like weapons, pointed reminders that obedience meant survival, and when questions arose, they were not merely brushed aside, they were smothered. It was the priest who stood at the center of it all. He was a tall man, gaunt from fasting, his face carved with sharp lines that seemed to catch the light of the altar candles in unsettling ways. His eyes were cold, not the softness of a shepherd guiding his flock, but the calculating stare of someone measuring obedience, testing loyalty. To the villagers, he was not only God's messenger, but also their judge, their confessor, their overseer. He heard their sins, their fears, their weaknesses whispered through the lattice of the confessional, and he carried that knowledge like a blade beneath his robes. When children vanished, some parents dared to bring their fears to him. They knelt before the altar, trembling, their voices breaking as they asked for guidance, for explanation. His responses were always the same: the disappearances were God's will, a test of faith, or punishment for sins committed by the community. He would urge repentance, fasting, prayer, more frequent attendance at Mass. He told them not to speak of curses or evil, for such talk was blasphemy, an invitation for the devil to enter their homes. And he did not merely suggest silence, he demanded it. His warnings were edged with threat, though never stated outright. To disobey him was to disobey God. And who among them dared risk eternal damnation when their lives on earth already teetered so precariously? But silence was not the only thing he demanded. As the vanishings increased, the priest's sermons grew harsher, more fiery. He thundered from the pulpit about purity, about the dangers of sin infecting even the young. He railed against disobedient children, against those who failed to honor their parents or the church. He spoke of innocent lambs led astray, of sacrifices demanded by heaven. Words that seemed innocuous enough when spoken in the language of Scripture, but to those who had lost children, they struck too close to home. It was as though he was justifying something, or perhaps hinting at it, couching dark truths within the safety of holy words. Whenever the villagers pressed him for more why, the searches never yielded answers. Why no travelers had been seen, why wolves left no blood, he would lean heavily on authority. The world, he said, was a mystery. God's ways were unknowable. To question was to sin. To persist was to endanger one's soul. And in a community so bound by faith, these words cut deeper than any blade. Parents who had lost everything still found themselves bowing their heads, muttering prayers through clenched teeth, because to resist him was to resist the order that governed their lives. There were those who tried to push further. One father, whose son had vanished near the churchyard, spoke too loudly at the tavern one night. insisting that the boy had been taken, not lost. He pointed at the church, his voice rough with anger, and accused it of hiding something. By morning, he was gone. Some said he left in shame, others whispered that he had been forced out, but the truth was that he vanished just as suddenly as the children. His family never saw him again. After that, no one dared raise their voice. The church discouraged, not just accusations, but investigations. When groups of men organized to search beyond the woods, the priest chastised them, warning that their time was better spent in prayer than chasing phantoms. When mothers gathered to share stories and suspicions, he scolded them from the pulpit for spreading poison through the village. Fear worked better than chains. Each warning, each threat disguised as holy counsel, tightened the net of silence. And still, the church demanded more loyalty. Festivals of penance were organized, where villagers whipped their own backs in the square, begging forgiveness for sins they did not understand. Families were asked to give offerings beyond their means, grain, coins, even livestock, because sacrifice was the only way to cleanse the stain of what was happening. Each time a child vanished, the priest announced that the community had failed, again in its devotion, that they must try harder, pray harder, obey harder, and each time, they complied. Because what else could they do? Yet beneath that forced devotion, the unease grew thicker. Some villagers began to notice strange details, things they wished they hadn't. A child seen entering the church at dusk, never emerging, candles burning inside long after the doors were locked. Low chants heard at night, when no mass was scheduled. A mother swore she heard crying echo from within the walls when she pressed her ear against the cold stone. Though she dared not tell anyone but her closest kin, these details never made it into records, never became accusations, but they lingered, fueling the unspoken suspicion that the church knew more than it ever admitted. The role of local authorities was no different. They answered to the church, not the people. The magistrate dismissed complaints as hysteria, noting that no bodies had ever been found. The constable, a devout man, refused to investigate further, claiming that to doubt the priest was to undermine order itself. In a place where the church's word was the highest law, there was no one left to appeal to, so the silence deepened. The walls of the church loomed higher than ever, a fortress of stone and authority, swallowing grief and fear alike. Each toll of the bell marked not just the passage of time, but the reinforcement of obedience. It was as though the building itself stood watch over the villagers, daring them to question, daring them to speak. And still, the children vanished, not every week, not every month, but enough to remind the villagers that the pattern had not ended, that their fear was not misplaced. Each absence left a wound that never healed, and yet no accusation was made. No confrontation staged. The church had made itself untouchable. Its authority was its shield, its shadow long enough to smother every whisper before it became a cry. The villagers continued their lives, planting, harvesting, praying, but beneath the surface, beneath the rituals and the obedience, a truth gnawed at them. The disappearances were not accidents, not acts of fate or hunger or beasts. They were happening too close, too often, and always in the presence of the one place they were taught never to question. The church was not just a sanctuary. It was the center of something they could not name, something they feared more than starvation, more than wolves, more than death itself. And in their silence, that truth festered, hidden but alive, just like the secrets that lay waiting within the church walls. The year was drawing toward its close when the repairs began. The air carried the damp heaviness of late autumn, the kind of chill that clung to bones and left every surface slick with condensation. The church had stood for centuries, but time had begun to leave its marks. Fine cracks split the outer walls like veins of some hidden sickness, and damp stains bled through the plaster inside, spreading wider with each rainstorm. The villagers muttered about signs, about faith faltering, about the wrath of God. The priest, with his booming sermons, insisted that the structure must be mended at once, lest the house of God itself fall into ruin. And so masons were summoned, men with rough hands and chisels, men who had no part in the whispers of disappearances, but who knew stone better than scripture. They began their work at dawn, when the light was still dim and gray, and the church loomed against the mist like a sentinel. The sound of hammers echoed through the valley, sharp strikes against brittle mortar. The villagers came and went, pausing in their daily chores to watch the workers scale ladders, their silhouettes black against the pale stone. At first, the repairs seemed routine. Loose masonry was chipped away, weak mortar replaced, crumbling sections shored up with timber. But then, as they reached one of the older walls along the northern side of the nave, something changed. It was subtle at first. A mason's hammer struck the stone, and the sound that came back was wrong hollow, where it should have been solid. The men exchanged looks, puzzled, and struck again. The echo carried differently, as if something lay behind the wall that was not stone at all. They pressed their ears to the surface, listening. A faint draft whispered through a hairline crack, carrying with it a smell that was neither earth nor dust, but something sharper, something metallic and faintly sweet. It was the smell of rot, long faded, but not forgotten. They worked carefully then, their tools slower, more deliberate. Chisels scraped at plaster, revealing layers beneath. As they pried apart the stones, flakes of mortar rained down, and the air grew colder, as though whatever had been sealed away for decades was exhaling its first breath. The crowd of villagers, curious at first, gathered in greater numbers, their murmurs rising with each strike of the hammer. The priest appeared, robes trailing, his face tight with something that looked very much like unease. He urged the men to move their work elsewhere, to focus on other parts of the wall, but the masons were stubborn. They had heard the hollow echo. They knew something lay behind, and craftsmen did not leave mysteries in stone. When at last the first block was pried free, silence fell. For a moment, no one breathed. Behind the stone was not earth, nor old timber, nor forgotten relics. It was pale and curved, unmistakable in its shape, a skull, small enough to rest in the palm of a hand. The socket stared out into the light, empty and endless. A woman in the crowd screamed. The mason dropped his chisel, and then, with hands trembling, they pulled away more stones. What emerged was a cavity, and within it, bodies tiny but pressed together, stacked as though they had been thrown in without care. 19 of them, though no one counted at first. The air that seeped from the opening was foul, stale, heavy with the memory of death. Bones tumbled outward, fragile and powdering at the edges, but still arranged in ways that spoke of their final moments. Small hands curled upward, as if clawing at the stone. Ribs bent unnaturally, as though twisted in struggle. Jawbones gaped open in silent screams that had never been heard. The villagers recoiled, crossing themselves, clutching children close. Murmurs swelled into cries, accusations, prayers. Some turned away, unable to look, while others pressed closer, compelled by horror. The masons, their faces gray with dread, continued clearing the cavity, revealing more remains. Each one no older than a child, barely into their teens. The number grew, and with it, the realization. This was not a single tragedy. Not a collapsed crypt, not an accident of burial. This was deliberate. The priest raised his voice above the chaos, demanding calm, insisting that these were old bones, relics of an earlier time when burial customs were different. He claimed the children must have been victims of plague, sealed within the walls to prevent the spread of disease. But even as he spoke, the evidence contradicted him. There were no signs of orderly placement, no shrouds, no coffins. The bones bore the unmistakable marks of those who had died, not of illness, but of suffocation. Their bodies had not been laid to rest, they had been forced into the walls, while still alive. The crowd's unease turned to anger, but anger muffled by fear. Who could they accuse? when the only authority in the village stood before them in robes of holiness. Mothers wept openly, clutching their remaining children, imagining them entombed in the cold stone. Fathers clenched their fists, but did not move. No one dared confront the priest directly. The weight of the church was too heavy, its grip too absolute, yet the discovery could not be undone. Word spread swiftly, carried from house to house, from village to neighboring hamlets. 19 children, hidden in the church walls. 19 small bodies, silenced beneath stone for decades. The workers who had uncovered the bones could not sleep for nights afterward, their dreams haunted by hollow-eyed skulls and the memory of tiny, twisted hands reaching for freedom. The villagers avoided the northern wall, averting their eyes as though the sight itself carried a curse. Still, questions burned. Who had placed the children there? Why had no one spoken? How could such a horror exist in a place of prayer? Some whispered of sacrifice, of old rituals buried beneath layers of Christianity, where innocents were offered to ensure the strength of the building. Others murmured darker suspicions that the priesthood itself had sanctioned the act, that the disappearances of recent years were part of the same pattern, hidden behind sermons and prayers. But no answers came. The priest forbade further discussion, warning that such blasphemies invited damnation. The authorities, when summoned, declared the matter settled, writing it off as an unfortunate relic of the past. The bones were gathered swiftly, buried quietly, in the churchyard without ceremony, without record. By morning, the wall was sealed again. New mortars smoothed over the cavity as if nothing had ever been there. Yet the villagers could not forget. They had seen the hollow sockets, the twisted limbs, the undeniable evidence of 19 young lives, stolen and hidden in the house of God. They had heard the silence when the stones were pried away, felt the rush of stale air that seemed to carry with it a chorus of unheard cries. And though the walls stood smooth once more, every time the bells tolled, every time the sermons thundered, every time a child's laughter echoed too close to the church, they remembered. The truth was out now, though smothered, though denied. It lingered, heavy and unspoken, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be buried. The years following 1872 were marked not just by silence, but by something more insidious and intentional erasure. To understand the loss of memory surrounding the 19 children, one must look at the way communities often choose forgetfulness over confrontation. The church where the tragedy occurred did not crumble into ruin. It stood, brick by brick, as if nothing unspeakable had ever taken place. The bells still rang. Weddings were celebrated beneath its roof. Families whispered prayers in its pews. And yet, within those very walls, hidden from sight, lay the sealed bodies of the innocent. Their presence was not simply ignored, it was deliberately pushed into the realm of things unsaid, becoming part of a culture of denial that allowed life to continue without facing the horror beneath. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. The first to notice were the older parishioners, who had lived through the rumors and heard faint accounts of what had been found in the foundations during the reconstruction years. Some swore that they remembered workers halting repairs when human bones surfaced, though these whispers were quickly buried under the insistence of the church leaders that such discoveries were relics of a distant plague century, a misfortune that had no bearing on the parish's present holiness. The words of the clergy carried weight, and with them came the subtle suggestion that pressing further would not only tarnish the church's reputation, but risk divine displeasure. For ordinary families, eager to cling to the stability of their faith in a time when famine and disease were not uncommon. The choice to forget was a survival instinct, but forgetting is never simple. The children's absence lingered in households that once belonged to them. In parish records, names faded prematurely, dates ended too soon. A baptismal line would stretch into nothingness, with no marriage entry to follow, no burial marker, above ground to mourn. Parents carried the hollow weight of unspoken grief, and neighbors, who suspected but did not question, learned to avert their eyes from the cracks in memory. The story of the 19 became something like a stain hidden beneath a carpet. Everyone knew it was there, but no one dared lift a corner to expose it. This silence did not emerge out of ignorance, but from collective will, a choice, conscious or not, to leave the truth sealed as tightly as the children themselves. There is a strange irony in how institutions work to maintain their own survival, often at the expense of truth. For the church, the discovery of 19 dead children, in its very structure, was an existential threat. Scandal could dissolve the congregation, invite government intervention, or even force demolition of the holy site. Reputation, in such matters, becomes more valuable than truth. Clerical leaders began to reshape the narrative, erasing evidence not only from the spoken record, but from written documents as well. Ledgers that may have contained references to missing children were quietly amended. Minutes from parish council meetings skipped crucial dates. The bishop's archives, where official correspondence was preserved, lost entire months of letters. Silence was not simply organic, it was cultivated, trimmed like a hedge, until nothing grew in the wrong direction. The result was a carefully manufactured absence, a hollow space where the memory of the 19 should have lived, and yet the dead resist erasure. Stories have a way of surviving, even when banished to the margins. Village gossip carried fragments of the truth. Children dared each other to run their hands along the outer walls of the church at dusk, swearing they could feel vibrations beneath the stone, faint as a heartbeat. Women, cleaning the pews, sometimes reported odd smells rising from the cracks in the floorboards, dismissed quickly as damp rot or animal decay. Farmers spoke of dogs who refused to enter the nave, pulling back with hackles raised, as though sensing what their masters chose not to. These eerie signs became folklore, drifting into the realm of ghost stories, where the reality of suffering was softened by superstition. It was easier to say the church was haunted than to admit it was a tomb. As generations passed, the truth grew ever more fragile, worn thin by time. The children who might have remembered their missing playmates grew old and died, leaving only fragments of memory in their wake. Descendants inherited silence as their legacy, accepting the gaps in their family trees as unanswerable mysteries. By the turn of the century, what had once been a raw wound had become a whisper, no less tragic, but easier to ignore. In this way, the silence transformed from a protective measure into a permanent forgetting. The church flourished. Its sermons were attended by the great-grandchildren of those who had once walked with the 19. They prayed beneath stained glass windows that caught the sunlight, never knowing that the shadows on the floor stretched over the very bones of the missing. Historians now argue that such erasures are rarely accidental. Collective forgetting often follows the path of power, guided by those who benefit most from amnesia. In this case, it was the clergy who held the authority to declare what was remembered and what was discarded. The official history of the parish became one of benevolence, charity, and faith, while the dark reality was banished to the realm of rumor. This pattern can be seen across countless tragedies in human history: mass graves tucked away beneath schools, orphanages, and churches, records altered or destroyed to preserve reputations, survivors silenced by shame or fear of reprisal. The case of the 19 children is not unique, but it is emblematic of how societies metabolize horror, digesting it into something unrecognizable, so that life may proceed uninterrupted. But the land remembers, even when people do not. Stones hold echoes. Soil does not lie. When modern researchers returned to examine the church foundations decades later, they noted the unusual density of bone material in the ground beneath the walls. Archaeologists, digging with gloved hands, found fragments too small to identify individually, but numerous enough to suggest more than coincidence. It was then that silence cracked slightly, and the old stories returned with sharper edges. The horror that had been hidden, though still not fully proven, began to claw its way back into consciousness. And once it was spoken aloud, once the possibility was acknowledged, the carefully constructed silence of a century began to collapse. Forgetting is never permanent. It is merely a pause in the life of a story, a pause imposed by fear, shame, or convenience. In the case of the 19 children, silence was both a shield and a weapon. It shielded the community from scandal, but it also weaponized their absence against memory, erasing them from the collective story of the parish. Yet, like all truths buried too deep, it had only to wait. The church may have held their bones, but time itself became their witness, and in that waiting silence, something darker than death lingered, a reminder that the forgotten are never truly gone. The winter of 1872 in that remote European village was already marked by misfortune. Crops had withered under an unforgiving drought the year before. Livestock had grown thin, and hunger whispered through homes that had once been proud. Misery, in such places, rarely walked alone. It brought with it superstition, fear, and suspicion. To the elders of the parish, it seemed inevitable that evil had crept into the soil itself, poisoning roots, spoiling births, and draining men of their strength. But whispers spread that it was not nature, nor God, nor even chance, that cursed the village. It was something much darker, something hidden beneath the very heart of their sacred place. The church, with its stone walls blackened by smoke from countless candles, was supposed to be the one refuge against calamity. But villagers began to notice things about it they had not before. At night, a hollow echo resounded through its nave, as though the earth itself shifted restlessly below. Masons repairing cracks in the foundation spoke of voids, empty spaces, sealed away under plaster and stone. Mothers swore they heard muffled cries during evening prayers, sounds that no wind could carry through stone. And the children of the village, always more sensitive to things unseen, refused to linger near the northern wall, their eyes wide, their hands trembling as if they heard something others could not. By spring, the murmurs had grown into a quiet panic. Parishioners sat rigidly during sermons, staring more at the walls than at the priest, when a young woman fainted during Mass, claiming she felt a hand clutching at her ankle from beneath the flagstones. The fear became harder to dismiss. People began avoiding the church at night, even though its bells were supposed to call them to safety. A few, emboldened by desperation, whispered of digging, tearing open the sealed foundations to see what had been entombed there. But fear of sacrilege restrained their hands. Until a carpenter named Jurgen decided silence was more dangerous than action. Jurgen had long suspected that the church's foundations concealed something grim. While repairing beams in the side chapel, he had struck the wall with his hammer and felt a resonance that could only come from hollow space. Against the priest's orders, he returned one night with a lantern and a chisel. He pried open a crack in the northern wall, the one that children shunned, and found stuffed deep within a scrap of faded fabric, child-sized, half-powdered with lime. His hands shook as he pulled it free, the fibers disintegrating between his fingers. He told no one at first, but he did not need to. Something of his fear clung to him, and the villagers soon noticed his haunted silence. It was the gravedigger, old Matthias, who finally brought the whispers into the open. Standing in the tavern one night, his cup shaking in his hand, he muttered words that silenced every voice in the room. He had seen tiny bones in the soil when digging near the churchyard, he said, bones that did not match those of full-grown men or women. At first he thought it was nothing, perhaps a burial shifted by roots, but when Jurgen quietly revealed what he had found, the two stories tangled together into something impossible to ignore. The next Sunday, the priest tried to stamp out the rumors with a fiery sermon, warning his flock against devilish inventions meant to turn them against their holy house. But his words rang hollow. Every face in the pews seemed fixed, not on him, but on the stone walls themselves, as though waiting for them to breathe. When the service ended, none lingered. They hurried out into the open air, crossing themselves not in reverence, but in fear. It was in this climate of suspicion that the villagers demanded an inquiry. A small group of men gathered by torchlight, sworn to secrecy, and returned to the church after midnight. They pried at the stone where Jurgen had opened his crack wider, until the mortar gave way. The air that exhaled from the hollow was stale and suffocating, carrying with it a sour stench that seemed impossibly old. What they saw by torchlight froze them where they stood, a cavity bricked into the wall, just large enough to hold bodies, and within, the faint outlines of what had once been children. There were no coffins, no markers, no Christian rites. Just tangled limbs, bone against bone, some still wrapped in the shreds of what looked like nightshirts. In the torchlight, empty eye sockets seemed to glare at the intruders, mouths caught forever in silence. Some bones were small enough to belong to toddlers, others to youths on the edge of adolescence. And though time had stripped away flesh and recognition, the number of skulls told its own story, too many to mistake, too deliberate to deny. When word spread, the village was thrown into chaos. Mothers clutched their children tighter, as though stone walls themselves might reach out to claim them. Fathers gathered in angry knots, demanding answers. Who had done this? Why had the priest never spoken of it? The priest, pale and trembling, swore ignorance. He claimed the foundations were older than his time, older even than the parish records. Perhaps, he suggested, the bodies had been hidden during plague years, when cemeteries overflowed. But the villagers knew plague victims had been buried en masse in the churchyard, never bricked away like shameful secrets. Theories swirled like wildfire. Some whispered that the children had been orphans, taken in by the church only to vanish without explanation. Others claimed they were the offspring of scandalous unions, hidden away to preserve the reputations of noble families who frequented the parish. The darkest whispers suggested sacrifice, that the foundation itself demanded life to sanctify the holy ground, a pagan echo swallowed by the church's walls. Whether truth or invention, the discovery became a curse in itself. Families demanded the remains be reburied properly, but the priest resisted, fearing desecration charges from higher authorities. In the standoff, the bodies remained entombed, hidden once more behind hastily resealed stone. Yet the villagers could no longer kneel before the altar without feeling the weight of those silent witnesses pressing in around them. Attendance dwindled, faith curdled into suspicion, and soon the church stood nearly abandoned, its bell tolling over empty fields. Stranger still were the accounts that followed. Travelers spoke of hearing children's laughter echo faintly inside the church long after its doors had been barred. Others swore they saw small shadows darting along the candlelit aisles, gone in an instant. The men who had pried open the wall found themselves plagued with dreams of suffocation, of being pressed into stone, of crying out only to be swallowed by silence. Some fell ill. One took to drinking until he wasted away, muttering of faces in the mortar. And so the mystery grew, until no clear truth could be drawn from it. Records from the diocese vanished, parish registers bore inexplicable gaps, and the priest himself was eventually transferred to another parish without explanation. By the time later generations asked about the church, the story had already slipped into legend, half believed, half denied. Yet those who remembered the hollow resonance of the stone, the child-sized bones, and the air that stank of secrets, knew better. Something had been buried beneath those walls, not just bodies, but the trust of an entire community. The records that survive from the winter of 1872 do not point to a single event, a neat conclusion, or a confessed crime. Instead, what remains is a haze of overlapping testimonies, missing pages in parish logs, and whispers that echo more than a century later. The story of the 19 children allegedly buried beneath the walls of St. Aurelia's Church was not uncovered in its own time, but rather pieced together by curious outsiders decades after the final stones had been sealed. By then, The original actors were dead or gone, and all that remained were fragments on unearthed bone. A letter too fragile to be handled, an oral tale passed from grandmother to grandson. Out of those fragments, a mystery took shape, one so unsettling that it seemed safer for some to deny it outright than to confront its implications. The absence of clear evidence made it easier to bury the past under layers of silence, yet the pieces that do survive suggest something deliberate and unholy, a truth too dreadful for the community to ever willingly acknowledge. It began with a rumor passed to a traveling journalist in the early 1890s, nearly 20 years after the supposed burial. He had stopped in the small town not far from the ruins of St. Aurelius to document the decline of coal mining in the region. But what caught his attention was not industry, but the locals' resistance to his questions about the church. "Ask about the stones," one old man said cryptically before shutting the door. The stones, and what was sealed inside them. When the journalist pressed further, he found himself met with cold stares and outright refusals. There was, he wrote, a palpable weight of things unsaid, as though the whole village conspired to protect the secret not from outsiders, but from themselves. The journalist eventually unearthed a letter, written by a parish caretaker to a distant cousin, in which he described hearing unholy sounds from beneath the mortar while helping repair a portion of the church wall. The letter did not say outright what the noises were, but his words carried a frantic, near hysterical tone. "It is not the wind, nor the settling of stone. It is a child's cry, low and muffled, as if the wall itself holds the voice captive." That single letter, dismissed by some as the ramblings of a superstitious man, became the centerpiece of speculation. Was it possible the caretaker had stumbled upon the truth, only to be silenced or ignored? Local oral tradition only deepened? The unease. Families spoke in hushed voices about 19 children who had gone missing from neighboring villages around the same time. No records survive of a search, nor were notices of the disappearances ever officially filed, but within family Bibles, in faint pencil, were marks of children lost, their deaths unexplained, their names left without proper burials in consecrated ground. It was as if, to the families themselves, mourning had to be conducted in secrecy. They knew the children were gone, but they could never claim them, never set flowers upon their graves, because there were none to be found. The absence of ritual, mourning, in itself, was a haunting sign that something had gone terribly wrong. When St. Aurelius was eventually deconsecrated and abandoned at the turn of the century, scavengers who stripped the building of its timber and stone claimed to have found bones embedded within the lower walls. Most dismissed them as remnants of earlier burials, common in medieval churches, where bones were often moved and hidden within walls to make space in graveyards. But others noticed that the bones were far too small, clearly belonging to children. One scavenger, interviewed later in life, admitted he took a skull the size of his palm home with him, though he claimed it was later lost in a house fire. His wife, in her own statement, confessed she believed the skull had cursed their family, for 3 of their children died before reaching adulthood. This superstition, tangled with the fragments of evidence, ensured that no one wanted to dig too deep, both literally and figuratively. Yet the questions never ceased entirely. How could 19 children vanish without attracting wider notice? The nearest city kept detailed death records, but when researchers compared names, gaps appeared. Certain children listed in census rolls simply disappeared from later documents, without burial certificates, without recorded cause of death. This bureaucratic void fed the belief that the disappearances had been quietly erased, scrubbed from the official record as though the children had never existed. Some argued it was the church itself that had orchestrated this silence, either to protect its clergy or to conceal some larger ritual. Others pointed toward the wealthy patrons of St. Aurelius, families who benefited from the church's power and would have had the means to suppress uncomfortable truths. The absence of Closure gave birth to theories as wild as they were chilling. Some whispered of ritual sacrifice, suggesting the children had been immured alive to consecrate the church's foundation. Others argued the act was less mystical and more sinister, that the children had witnessed something forbidden, or were deemed burdens by their impoverished families, and the church had provided a way to make them disappear. No matter the theory, all shared one common horror: the belief that the 19 had not been given to the earth in peace, but had been trapped in stone, silenced forever, beneath hymns and sermons. By the mid-20th century, historians trying to trace the origins of the tale found themselves entangled in contradictions. Skeptics insisted it was folklore, a tale meant to explain both missing children and the decay of a once sacred building. Believers countered with testimonies of unearthed bones, letters, and whispered genealogies that bore the scars of erasure. In the absence of physical proof, the church having been dismantled almost entirely, no one could confirm or deny the truth. And so the mystery hardened, like mortar, around the story itself. The lack of resolution became the story. Even now, those who walk the grounds where St. Aurelius once stood say they feel a strange stillness there, as if the air resists sound. Visitors sometimes describe a sudden hush, a pressure in the ears, and for some, the faint impression of distant voices. Are these echoes of trauma carried through generations, or the restless spirits of those whose cries were swallowed by stone? Skepticism dismisses such experiences as tricks of the mind, but the persistence of the accounts suggests otherwise. Something remains, whether memory or presence, and it unsettles anyone who dares to linger too long. The secrecy that cloaked the supposed burial in 1872 has endured far longer than any of its participants. It lives in fragmented records, in suppressed mourning, in the way locals still avoid speaking openly of the 19. And perhaps that is the truest horror of the tale, not just the possible crime itself, but the silence that followed, the collective choice to let the stones conceal what words could not bear to acknowledge. Imagine standing in a place where history still whispers through the cracks in the walls, where forgotten voices beg to be remembered. What you've just heard tonight is more than just a story. It's a haunting piece of the past, one that was nearly erased. These stories, buried deep under centuries of silence, remind us how much of history was hidden, manipulated, or simply left to rot in the shadows. And it's in uncovering them slowly, carefully, piece by piece, that we begin to understand how fragile truth really is. If this journey unsettled you, if it left you with more questions than answers, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Because here, we don't just tell history, we dig into the forgotten corners, peel away the layers of dust and fear, and bring light to what was meant to stay hidden. So, if you felt the weight of this story, if you want to explore more disturbing truths, forbidden histories, and dark mysteries that lie beneath the surface of the world we think we know, then I ask you to subscribe. Join this growing community of seekers, the ones who don't look away when history turns ugly, but instead lean closer, determined to know. And now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe the story of the 19 children was an accident? Or was it something far darker, deliberately concealed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading every single one. Together, let's uncover the secrets no one else dares to tell.